Hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Kennedy, and welcome to week 4 of our in-depth discussion of the wave principle. Now, in the last few weeks, what we've done is we've kind of been doing a basic review, maybe a little bit more beyond basic, say intermediate review of the Elliott wave principle. We started off looking at impulse waves, then we moved on to diagonals. Last week, we discussed the zigzag. So this week on our schedule, we're going to be looking at the flat correction. And this is a flat correction. Now, again, just to kind of go back and reaffirm what we've already discussed before, what you're looking at here in this slide, these are the 5 foundational wave patterns which make up the wave principle. Everything that we know about the Elliott wave principle is built upon these 5 patterns. Now, we have 2 types of classifications for these patterns: motive waves, which would include the impulse and the diagonal, and then corrective waves, the zigzag, the flat, and the triangle. Okay, well, again, this week we're going to be focusing on the flat pattern. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at that. Okay, so this is a flat correction, and just a few things I would like to point out on this diagram. Notice in the upper left-hand corner, you have the notation 3, 3, 5. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it essentially means that your first wave, wave A, is going to subdivide into 3 smaller waves. And this is also, too, kind of an important aspect of the wave principle in that it is fractal. It is fractal in nature, meaning that these patterns that we work with as Elliotticians actually build larger and smaller versions of themselves. One way to kind of understand what a fractal is, just imagine in your mind's eye 10 miles of coastline, what that would look like from, say, a helicopter. Well, if you go higher up in elevation, and then you look at 100 miles of coastline, it actually looks pretty much the same thing as 10 miles of coastline. So what we're looking at here is we're basically understanding that our initial move down in wave A is going to subdivide into 3 waves. This could be a zigzag, a flat, but it will be a 3-wave move. And then your wave B will also, too, subdivide into a 3-wave structure. That's why Elliotticians use the notation of 3, 3, 5 to denote a flat correction. Now, of course, wave C, because that's a 5-wave move, that's going to unfold as an impulsive decline. It's going to look like one of these, but to the downside. Okay, now just like what we learned last week as far as the subdivisions or the notations we use whenever we look at a zigzag, the notation we use for a zigzag is a 5-3-5 pattern. A flat is a 3-3-5 formation. Now next, let's move on and take a look a little bit at the slope analysis of this formation, because that's also, too, quite important in my opinion in being able to accurately and correctly identify the formation. Now, whenever we were looking at the zigzag, you might remember my discussion on slope analysis, where typically in an idealized version of the pattern, a zigzag, what we tend to see is that wave C exhibits a less aggressive, say, period of decline than what was witnessed in wave A. So that's why the slope of your wave C more often than not, and I'm using air quotes, is going to be less aggressive or more shallow than what was experienced in wave A. Now, when it comes to a flat correction, just the opposite is going to occur. What you're going to see is that wave C is going to be more aggressive than what actually occurred in the wave A. So you can kind of see where, as far as the sell-off from the extreme of wave B to the end of wave C, that's a little bit more aggressive than what we actually experienced in wave A. Now, one more thing to understand about a flat correction is the wave B, okay? Now, the key characteristic of a flat correction is that wave B will end at or near the origin point of wave A. Now, the minimum retracement that I allow for wave B is 80%. Okay, now I know it says 90% in the book, and whenever I say the book, I'm referring to the wave principle written by A.J. Frost and Robert Prechter. Again, there's no other better work on the wave principle. If you want to learn the wave principle, you have to start there. He's my go-to guy as far as understanding the wave principle, so I highly, again, recommend that book. Now, in his book, he does mention that the minimum retracement for wave B of wave A is 90%. But when you begin looking at, say, highly leveraged markets or, say, futures markets, for example, just from, say, counting waves for 30 years, which is what I've done, I've observed that 80% is really the sweet spot. So for a flat correction to be identified correctly as a flat correction, you need a few components. Number one, wave A needs to subdivide into 3 waves, and wave B needs to retrace at least 80% of wave A. And then following that retracement in wave B, and again, that's going to be a 3-wave move, then we're going to be looking for a 5-wave decline for wave C. Now, next, let's move on and take a look at another, say, component that we discussed whenever we were reviewing the zigzag, and that is the idea of the corrective price channel. Now, the corrective price channel is part of a trend line algorithm technique that I developed 20 years ago, and I still use today, because it's very effective in allowing you to be able to confidently differentiate between motive wave formation or motive wave structure and also corrective wave structure. So we saw how when we were working with the zigzag, we discussed the corrective price channel, and simply put, counter trend price action tends to be contained by parallel lines. So I drew some parallel lines on the zigzags that we were working with last week. Well, whenever it comes to a flat correction, sometimes the wave patterns or the corrective price channel is a little bit more unique. So what I tend to do, or what I've learned in utilizing this technique, is that ideally what you're going to work with is initially start off with your basic channel. And let me pull over another slide here. This would be your basic channel. Again, we'll be discussing Fibonacci proportion within the flat pattern in tomorrow's episode, but this would be a corrective price channel, because the most common relationship between wave B and wave C of a flat correction is equality. So this is what you would typically work with, okay? But over the years, I've observed whenever, say, for example, wave B is an 80% retracement of wave A, or perhaps wave B is an expanded flat, then we have to learn how to adapt and draw that corrective price channel a little bit differently. So the rule of thumb I employ whenever I'm utilizing a corrective price channel when the underlying structure is that of a flat correction is, rather than drawing the initial trend line, which would be from the origin of wave A to the extreme of wave B, instead of doing that, what I like to do is I like to put that, say, pivot point at the extreme of wave 2 of C. Now, sometimes, depending on the overall structure, you may end up having to utilize the wave 4 extreme of wave C. So if we just go ahead and draw the line again, what we do is we start at the origin of wave A, and what we're doing is we're constructing a corrective price channel. You go not to the extreme of wave B, but to the extreme of wave 2 of C. And then you take a parallel of that line and drop it down to the wave A extreme, and then that should give you support for your wave 5 of C decline, or your wave C decline. Now, again, in some instances, particularly if you're working, say, for example, an expanded flat, then you might need to utilize the extreme of wave 4. So your trend line would start at the origin of wave A and then go to the extreme of wave 4 of C. And then you would take a parallel and then drop that down to the extreme of wave A. That's how you would draw that secondary. But these are the 2 pivot points. So when the underlying structure, the underlying corrective pattern that you're working with is that of a flat correction, rather than using the extreme of wave B as your pivot point for your trend lines, which is exactly what you would do if you were working a zigzag, with a flat correction, I instead use the extreme of wave wave 2 or wave 4 of C. And then that again identifies, say, trend line support for wave C. Okay, now next let's move on and take a look at some examples here. And we'll do that in just a moment by looking at a price chart of AutoZone. So let me pull that price chart up as I move from one page to another page. Now in AutoZone, what we're going to be looking at here again are just some examples of flat corrections in the real world on a real price chart. So don't look at that chart just yet. Let me bring over the price chart of AutoZone, ticker symbol AZO. And here's a good example, a very good example of a basic flat correction. Okay, remember, let's just kind of go through some of the guidelines. The substructure of a flat correction is 335. So down from the high here, And this is our flat correction. Basically, everything that you see in the shaded block here, that's a flat correction. So beginning the pattern here, you can clearly see you have a down, up, down sequence. Those are my three waves. And then on the subsequent advance, you have an up, down, up sequence. Okay, that's our three-wave rally. So wave A subdivides into three waves, wave B subdivides into three waves, and then you can see our fifth wave move down in wave C. Okay, now also too, remember the slope analysis? All we have to do to kind of get an idea of slope analysis is simply measure the decline from high to low, and notice that the decline in wave C is, say, more aggressive than what occurred in wave A. In other words, it was a shorter duration period to complete the totality of the wave C decline than what occurred in the initial sell-off that we're identifying as wave A. Also, too, notice the key characteristics are being adhered to. Typically, what we see as far as relationships, and again, tomorrow we're going to be looking at Fibonacci relationships typically encountered within this specific pattern. And then we're also going to be looking at some variations to the flat structure by looking at the expanded flat and then also to the running flat. But I'm going to save that commentary until tomorrow's episode. So what we're looking at here is, again, one of the key characteristics of a flat correction is that wave B ends at or near the origin point of wave A. And you can clearly see that's exactly what's transpired here in AutoZone. And then the most common relationship between C and wave A is equality. Notice we came down and pretty much a little bit of a quality measurement multiple between wave C and wave A. So this is a fairly good, say, textbook example of a flat that not only demonstrates the most common relationships we find between wave C and wave A, but is also a good example of the, say, key defining characteristics of the pattern and also, too, the slope analysis that we tend to encounter as well. Now let's look at another example here. Okay, here is a flat correction in Lam Research Corporation, ticker symbol LRCX. Okay, now in this example here, what you'll notice is that wave C did indeed move beyond the equality multiple between wave C and wave A. But once again, you can see how wave C was a bit more aggressive than the initial sell-off in wave A. And you do have an 80% retracement in wave B. So again, 3 waves down in wave A, 3 waves up in wave B, followed by a volatile move in wave C, which again pushes prices back to below the extreme of wave A. Ideally, again, we look for equality, but that equality idea, as we discussed last week and what we've been discussing for the last few weeks, when it comes to Fibonacci retracements, Fibonacci multiples, Fibonacci dividers, and the type of, say, idealized Fibonacci relationships we like to see within Elliott wave structure, those are just guidelines. It's not a rule, okay? So it is possible, even though we like to see wave C equal the length traveled in wave A, again, that's a guideline because sometimes wave C can be shorter than wave A, in which case that would be a running flat, a flat correction with a truncated or failed C wave. Or some perhaps even in a running flat, what you'll see that same thing where wave C is less than the distance traveled in wave A, but we'll be talking about that tomorrow. But again, going back to that idea on Fibonacci relationships, these are offered as guidelines. So it's just not a hard, fast rule that wave C has to equal wave A and anything greater or less than equality makes the pattern incorrect. That's not true. Okay, so here's a flat correction in Lam Research. Here's a flat correction on the weekly price chart of GLD. This is the ETF that tracks the gold market. Going back to the high that occurred in 2020, you have an initial 3-wave move down for wave A, 3-wave move up in wave B, and then a 5-wave decline in wave C. Okay, now if we were to employ our corrective price channel, what we would do, start at the origin of wave A, go to the extreme of wave 2 of C, which is right there, drop your parallel line down to the extreme of wave A, and now you have trend line support for where you're looking basically for a reversal in price in wave C. Again, clearly a 3-wave decline, certainly not a 5-wave move. Clearly a 3-wave move up, certainly not a 5-wave move. And then within the wave C decline, we have waves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. A 9-wave wave count basically denotes impulsive structure. And also, 2, notice the slope analysis in wave C. Again, much more aggressive than what occurred in wave A. And lastly, let's take a look at another flat correction that we've been playing with in Paychex, ticker symbol PAYX. Remember, the larger pattern beginning back in 2022 is that of a complex correction. Remember, we talked a little bit about complex corrections last week. All a complex correction is, it's two corrective wave patterns joined together by an X wave. Now, the initial decline, again, going back to last week's lesson, this is a zigzag. This is a 5-3-5 pattern. Notice the slope analysis. Again, wave A is very aggressive. Meanwhile, wave C is less aggressive. Again, this is typical of a zigzag. Also, too, wave C of our zigzag here took the shape of an ending diagonal. Okay, we've talked about that pattern before. An ending diagonal is limited as to where it may actually occur. It can only occur in the fifth wave position of an impulse wave or as wave C of either a zigzag or flat. Now, upon the completion of this ABC decline, what we're going to now look for is a zigzag. An X wave, okay? Because we're working the larger complex correction. And remember what we talked about also too last week when we were doing analysis of the double zigzag. X waves tend to end at or near the extreme of wave B of wave W. And that's exactly where we saw prices move to. This initial advance was the three-wave move. The initial decline, the subsequent decline was a three-wave move. And then that was followed by, again, something much more decisive than what occurred in wave A. So again, we see the key characteristics of a flat correction representing wave X. So in this instance here, it does appear to be a double zigzag because our initial decline was a zigzag, but our X wave of the complex correction has taken the shape of a flat pattern. Okay, again, three waves up, three waves down, followed by a five-wave move, and then of course we've seen the reversal. So moving forward, we're going to continue to track this complex correction in Paychex and look for another 5-3-5 pattern to complete a double zigzag. Well, that's about it for me for today. As always, thank you very much. Again, tomorrow we're going to continue this discussion of flat corrections by getting a little